Dave Rubin has been through a few conversions over the last several years, and it's hard not to doubt the sincerity of them given that they seem to follow a paycheck. He used to be on the Young Turks where he promoted left-leaning ideas, but then he quit TYT and struck out on his own. At first he made some gestures towards centrism, but he seemed to abandon that after a short time as well. It seems as though the more he got attention and commendation from conservatives with deep pockets, the further to the right his politics seemed to move, the more he seemed to conform to his new friends' ideas. Joe Rogan won't answer his calls anymore, and once mentioned that he doesn't like to associate with people who aren't sincere, and it seems quite clear that he was referring to Dave Rubin. He used to identify as an atheist, but now he says that's not quite accurate. He credits hanging out with Jordan Peterson as a catalyst for that. I guess we are to take this as a side effect of being exposed to so many high-level important ideas.
So I grew up in a conservative Jewish household in New York. We kept kosher, we did Shabbat on Friday nights, all the big holidays. But there was a strong secular belief within that. And as I was telling you sort of backstage, there's an interesting piece related to Judaism that I think is a little different than other religions in that the ethnic tie to it, at least in a modern way, is for most Jews more important than the religious nature of it specifically, let's say belief specifically, because John, as we were talking about, there are many, many Jews, especially in sciences and in mathematics, that aren't believers per se, but have a real cultural affinity. And I would say that that's sort of where I'm at, or at least where I've been over the last couple of years. I actually am now in the last few years, and this has to do a lot with being on tour with Jordan Peterson for a year. Jordan and I did about 110 stops in one calendar year in about 20 countries. It was pretty amazing. And when you spend that kind of time listening to a true innovative thinker, I mean, truly the guy that I think is the world's most important public philosopher, let's say, talking about his biblical lectures and talking about his perspective on life, and that there has to be a bedrock of something that is real and true outside of us.
What does that have to do with God? Why can't something outside of us simply be material reality? This sounds like a lack of doctrinal commitment to me.
And then how he relates that through the biblical stories. It moved me. It moved me over the course of the year that we did this together. So I would say I'm secular basically in my life, but I definitely in the last year have found that there has to be something outside of us.
This seems to me like Dave wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to identify as a theist, but he doesn't seem to be making much of a lifestyle commitment to it. But of course, I can't say for sure whether Dave is sincere or not. On the one hand, Dave likes to follow the money. On the other hand, as Brett Weinstein has said, Dave is hearing the cheers of a bunch of people who are all concentrated on one mindset. And he thinks that what he's saying is making sense, and in fact, he seems to be making less sense over time, as he is moving closer to a group that is united behind ideas that are not robust. That's centrist, for he's been taken in by charlatans and is falling for bullshit. So it's possible that he's just been taken in by woo. On the third hand, he also seems to like to fluff up the things his buddies say.
My brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Oh my God, oh my God.
So maybe he's falling for the stuff his buddies say, or maybe he just wants them to believe that he's falling for it so they will support him.
The rest of this makes no sense. I mean, the part, very briefly, the part that I'm really known for is the political part, and that I was a lefty, and the difference between leftism.
You kind of had a political conversion.
I had it, right. So yeah. I'm usually much more comfortable talking about my political conversion than a religious one. But I would say this, that consistent with me talking about sort of what's happened with the postmodern left, with the progressives, and we see this now, where there's sort of nothing that's empirically true.
I'm not sure Dave has a firm grasp of what he's talking about here. First of all, he seems to be conflating folks on the left with postmodernists. And secondly, he's repeating a common misconception about postmodernists. I think he's referring to folks who point out that there are multiple ways to frame and interpret data. But that doesn't mean that they believe that what the data says doesn't matter, or that any interpretation is as good as any other. Also, it's quite rich that someone would turn to theism because they believe in empiricism.
And any given day, you can feel anything anything about any particular topic.
As ephemeral as feelings are, I don't know anyone on the postmodern left who believes that on any given day you can feel anything about any particular topic. And how you feel about a topic doesn't necessarily change what empirical data you believe in, even if you are a postmodernist.
There's a reason for that. And the reason is they've disconnected everything. Their whole worldview is disconnected to anything that came before them.
What does that have to do with empiricism? To be thoroughly empirical is to take into account all of the relevant evidence, including the most up-to-date evidence. One's connection to what came before you should only hold as long as it isn't obsolete. There's nothing empirical about committing oneself to obsolete evidence. Also, I've never heard any postmodernists say that everything that came before them is wrong or should be ignored, if that's what you mean by disconnected.
So that could be God or a religious set of ideas or something like that.
Insofar as the postmodern left reject God or religious ideas, which is not inherent to postmodernism or leftism, it isn't merely because those ideas are old. It's because they don't stand up to scrutiny, especially in light of the most up-to-date empirical data.
So I'm really, really fascinated by that at the moment, and it's changing how I live my life. I just did, it was Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in Judaism.
You earlier said you were basically secular in your life, so it couldn't have changed how you live your life very much.
I was at a service that was actually at a church in Pasadena in Los Angeles, hosted by Dennis Prager, that I'm sure many of you guys know about. Dennis Prager, who many of you know. So I would say I'm in it the way you guys are all in it, well, trying to find some truth in the madness.
I suspect that the way a lot of those religious folks are in it involves a robust opposition to gay marriage, Dave.
I'll be interested to tease that out a little more in due course. I mean, one thing I did notice is I had seen, just watching some of your videos, that there definitely been a progression in your thinking on this. And probably if you go back a few years, I think you had said along the lines of you probably thought of yourself as an atheist, but evidently that's not quite the case anymore.
Well, I had a bunch of atheists, high-profile atheists on the show in a row, starting with Sam Harris, who I admire, and he's a good friend of mine, and Michael Shermer and Peter Boghossian. And I really love the intellectual side of that. I really, really do love it. And that's not at the exclusion of anything else, actually. But what I found was that I had a series of atheists on in a row, and then people online just kept saying that I was an atheist.
Right.
And then I sort of just said it one day without, it didn't mean anything to me sort of one way or another. It was almost, it just sort of came out of my mouth one day.
Here's a revelation that I'm sure will shock everybody. Dave Rubin sometimes just says things without really giving any thought about what they mean.
And then 2 years ago, I do this off-the-grid August thing where I literally lock my phone in a safe and I don't look at any news or television. I am completely offline and I really disappear and I try to let my brain reset. And 2 years ago when I did it, one of the thoughts that I kept having sort of in my piece was that I'm not an atheist. And I came back and I said it in a very casual way. I just did this live stream where I just sort of said it very flippantly, that I just don't like the word atheist. It doesn't fit what I believe. I do believe in something else, even if I can't completely articulate what it is. I think Jordan has gone a long way to articulating the type of thing that I believe in.
Well, if your belief renders you a non-atheist, then what this something else you believe in must be some kind of deity. Otherwise, there would be no tension between this belief and atheism. Don't beat yourself up too much about not being able to articulate what it is, though. I've never seen any theist who can articulate what they mean by God in any way that I can recognize as coherent. And that's especially the case with Jordan Peterson. I've never seen anyone break the 10th rule of Peterson's book more than Peterson does.
And I got a lot of hate for that one. Because, the atheists, they don't like a converted person either. So, you got to watch out for that too. So, we all have our own trappings, but what I'm most interested in is talking to people from all walks of life and figuring out what the common stuff is. And what I like to frame that around is a conversation about freedom and how do we limit government so we can all believe what we want to believe and think what we want to think and be part of a society that's pluralistic and decent for all of us.
That's a bit tangential to his belief in God, but also hard to square with his endorsement of Brazilian President
Bolsonaro
Because he's trying to get the SJW stuff out of schools.
trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him.
How does a government official trying to prevent schools from teaching certain subjects facilitate talking to people from all walks of life and limiting government so we can all believe what we want to believe and think what we want to think? It seems to me that banning something as nebulous and potentially as broadly definable as SJW stuff does the opposite of that. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.